The glass of Amarone, blood-red and thick, was halfway to Don Tommaso's lips when he froze. The toast to a profitable, if bloody, quarter died in his throat. The low hum of conversation in the lavish penthouse dining room sputtered into silence. 20 of the most dangerous men in the northern Italian Lake District held their breath, because a sound, thin and reedy, was cutting through the tension. A child's voice, singing from a room down the hall. It was a lullaby. Old Sicilian. The kind your nonna might sing, a melody woven from sun-baked earth and forgotten village squares. A song Tommaso hadn't heard in 50 years. Not since his own mother sang it to him, in a small house in Palermo, before the world turned him to stone. His hand, marked with old scars, lowered the glass to the table without a sound. His cold, flint-gray eyes, which moments before had been calculating the loyalty of every man present, were now lost, fixed on some invisible point in the past. The man known as the architect for his ruthless, precise expansions had been dismantled by a few simple notes. In the nursery, Ilara adjusted the blanket over the small, feverish boy. Matteo, the son of Don Tommaso's late consigliere. His breathing was a little easier now. She'd been hired 3 weeks ago, a temporary solution. Ilara Volterra, not a nanny by trade. She was a musicologist, a doctoral student from a small university in Bologna, specializing in the folk traditions of southern Italy. Her presence here, in this fortress of glass and steel overlooking Lake Como, was supposed to be for 6 weeks of fieldwork, a unique opportunity to document the living oral histories within a closed traditional community. She never imagined the community would be this. She sang the last verse, her voice softening to a whisper. The song was a secret weapon, one she'd found in a crumbling journal in a Palermo archive. A song for calming restless spirits, for soothing nightmares. It seemed to be working. As the final note faded, she felt, rather than saw, the presence in the doorway. She turned slowly. Tommaso stood there, a mountain of a man in a tailored charcoal suit, silhouetted against the golden light of the hall. He filled the space, his silence more intimidating than any shout. The security detail that was always a discreet 10 paces behind him had been ordered to stay back. He was alone. His gaze moved from her face to the sleeping child, then back to her. The raw, unguarded shock she had seen from across the apartment was gone, replaced by a terrifying intensity. "Where did you learn that song?" His voice was low, a gravelly rumble that vibrated in the quiet room. It wasn't a question. It was an interrogation. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs. This was the moment, the reason she was here, not for her thesis, but for the faded photograph in her wallet. A woman with her own eyes, smiling beside a young man who looked like a softer version of the Don before her, her grandmother, Sophia, and Tommaso's father. "It was my grandmother's," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Sophia. She taught it to me." Tommaso's expression didn't change, but a tiny muscle twitched in his jaw. Sophia. A name from another life. A ghost. He took a single step into the room, and the air grew cold. Sophia Volterra is dead. She had no family. She had a daughter, Ilara whispered, holding his gaze. "Who had me. She told me stories about a boy from her village. A boy named Tommaso, who loved figs from the neighbor's tree, promised to protect her." She reached slowly into her pocket, pulling out the worn photograph. She didn't hand it to him. She held it up. She never forgot that promise. And neither have I. Tommaso's eyes locked on the image. For a breathtaking second, Ilara saw the ghost of that boy in the hard lines of the man's face. Then it was gone, sealed away behind a mask of cold authority. He didn't look at the photo again. He looked at her, a new, calculating light in his eyes. The emotional aperture had slammed shut. "My head of security, Silas," will be in to speak with you," he said, his tone flat and final. "Do not leave this room." He turned and walked out, pulling the door closed behind him. The soft click of the lock was deafening. Ilara let out a shaky breath, sinking into the chair beside Matteo's bed. The first part was over. She had thrown the stone into the pond. Now she had to navigate the ripples. She had just confronted one of the most powerful criminals in Europe with a piece of his own forgotten humanity. And from the look in his eyes as he left, she wasn't sure if she had just saved herself or signed her own death warrant. Down the hall, Tommaso didn't return to his guests. He walked straight to his study, a sterile, modern space of glass and titanium. He dismissed his men with a sharp gesture. Alone, he poured a finger of grappa, his hand perfectly steady. He downed it in one burning gulp. Sofia. The name was a key turning in a lock he'd thought rusted shut. He opened a hidden drawer in his desk, bypassing encrypted laptops and weapons, and pulled out a simple wooden box. Inside, nestled on faded velvet, was a single dried fig stem. A stupid, sentimental token from a life he'd burned to the ground. He had built his empire on a foundation of blood and absolute control. He was the architect. And this girl, this Ilara with Sofia's eyes and a siren's song, had just walked in and placed a stick of dynamite at its very core. She was either a miraculous gift from a past he'd abandoned, or the most sophisticated weapon his enemies had ever devised. And he had just locked her in a room, right at the heart of his home. The game had changed. The toast was forgotten. The war was no longer just outside his doors. It was now sleeping in the nursery down the hall. The man who arrived wasn't the hulking, silent type Ilara expected. Silas was lean, dressed in an impeccably tailored but understated navy suit, with the calm, analytical eyes of a forensic accountant. He carried a tablet, not a gun. He stood just inside the locked door, his gaze performing a swift, impersonal scan of the room, the sleeping child, and finally, her. "Ilara Volterra," he said, his voice a soft, neutral tenor. "My name is Silas. I handle security and logistics for Don Tommaso." He didn't smile. He was a man who dealt in facts, not pleasantries. "For your safety and the safety of the household, I need to ask you some questions. It would be best if you answered them completely." This was the first test, the real one. Tommaso had been a storm of emotion and memory. Silas was a wall of pure, unfeeling logic. Ilara folded her hands in her lap, willing them not to tremble. "I understand," he began, his questions precise and relentless. He confirmed the basic details of her cover story, her doctoral program, her advisor's name, the grant that supposedly funded her fieldwork. He was aware of the journal she'd cited in her application to the household's cultural liaison. He knew things she'd almost forgotten herself. He was cross-referencing a live person against a digital record, and he was doing it in real time. Then he moved to the heart of the matter. "Your grandmother, Sofia Volterra. Her maiden name was Rossini. She left Sicily for Bologna in 1965. She never married." It wasn't a question. It was a statement, designed to see if she would contradict the established record. The record he had undoubtedly just pulled up on his tablet. "That's correct," Ilara said, her throat tight. "She raised my mother alone. She never spoke of my grandfather, only that he was a promise that was broken." Silas's eyes flickered up from his screen, meeting hers. "And you believe Don Tommaso is connected to this? Broken promise?" "I know he is," she said, her voice gaining strength. She had to own this, to sell the half-truth as the whole. "My grandmother told me stories about the boy, Tommaso, from her village. She told me about the fig tree. She told me the lullaby was his mother's favorite. When I saw the opportunity to study here, near men who came from that same world, I had to try. I had to see if the stories were true, to understand where I came from. It was a perfect, emotional, and barely disguised lie. It painted her as a naive, sentimental girl searching for her roots, stumbling into a dragon's den out of curiosity. It was the story she had crafted for months, and she delivered it with the conviction of someone who believed it herself. Silas watched her for a long, silent moment. His expression was unreadable. He typed a few more notes onto his tablet. The Don has instructed that you are to remain here as Mateo's caretaker until the situation is fully assessed. Your research is terminated, effective immediately. You will not contact the university. You will not have a phone. Your laptop and passport will be secured. For your safety. The walls of the gilded cage were being erected, one polite, reasonable sentence at a time. Protective custody. Forced proximity. It was happening exactly as she knew it would, yet the reality of it was a cold shock. What situation? She dared to ask. I sang a song. I showed him a photograph. The situation, Silas repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument, is that an unknown variable has been introduced into a highly complex and sensitive ecosystem. We assess the variable. We determine its intent. And then we decide if it is integrated or removed. He turned to leave, pausing at the door. Someone will bring you dinner. Do not attempt to leave this room. The lock clicked shut again. Ilara let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. She had passed the first interrogation. She had been categorized as a variable. It was better than being called a corpse. Down the hall in his study, Tommaso stared at the live feed from the nursery camera on his desktop monitor. He had watched the entire exchange, his expression granite. Silas entered without a sound, standing by the door. Well, Tommaso's voice was rough. Her story is internally consistent and matches the available data, Silas reported. It is sentimental, and therefore high risk. Sentiment is unpredictable. Sentiment is a weakness, Tommaso corrected, his eyes still on the screen where Ilara was now gently stroking Mateo's forehead. But it can also be a lever. She is a lever, Silas, either for us or against us. I want to know which. I want a deep background trace. Go back further. I want to know every person Sofia Volterra ever spoke to. I want to know who Ilara's real grandfather was. You think this is a play from a rival family? The Lombardos? Using the girl to get to you through the past? Tommaso finally turned from the screen, his flint gray eyes cold. I think a woman who looks like my past and sings my mother's songs didn't find me by accident. And if she is a weapon, I want to know who aimed her. He stood up, straightening his cuffs. In the meantime, we proceed. The shipment from Valencia is due. I want the details finalized. This household does not stop for ghosts. But as he walked out, his gaze drifted once more toward the hallway leading to the nursery. The household might not stop, but he had. For a few moments, he had been that boy in the dirt, tasting stolen figs. And part of him, a part he thought long dead, was terrified that he wanted to taste it again. The girl with the lullaby hadn't just disrupted his evening. She had breached his defenses, and she didn't even need a gun to do it. She was just a song, a memory, and a pair of eyes that saw the boy inside the monster, and that made her the most dangerous thing he had ever encountered. The dinner arrived on a silver tray, delivered by a stone-faced woman who didn't meet Ilara's eyes. Roasted chicken, steamed vegetables, and a small pot of creamy risotto. It was prison food served on fine china. Mateo slept on, his breathing a soft, steady rhythm in the dim room. Ilara ate mechanically, her mind racing. Silas's words echoed, integrated or removed. She was a variable, a problem to be solved. This was the dangerous, fragile ground she had to navigate. She had to be compelling enough to be integrated, to stay close to Tommaso, but not so threatening that she triggered a swift removal. She had to walk the razor's edge between a sentimental girl and a cunning operative. Her life depended on the performance. An hour later, the lock clicked again. Ilara's heart jumped into her throat. But it wasn't Silas, and it wasn't the silent woman. It was Tommaso. He had changed into a black sweater and dark trousers, looking less like a corporate kingpin and more like a predator in its natural habitat. He carried 2 small glasses and a bottle of amber liquid. He didn't speak. He set a glass on the small table beside her, filled it, then poured one for himself. He stood by the window, his back to her, looking out at the lights of Bellagio sparkling like fallen stars on the far shore of the lake. The silence was a physical weight. "Tell me about the fig tree," he said, his voice low, not turning from the window. It was a test, a deeper one than Silas's. This one was for the ghost he remembered. Alara took a slow breath, wrapping her hands around the cool glass. She let her gaze go soft, looking into the past she had only ever visited in stories. She said it was in the vacant lot between two houses. The figs were small but sweet as honey. The boy Tommaso knew how to find the perfect ones, the ones the sun had touched just right. He'd get in trouble for tearing his clothes on the fence, but he'd always bring her the best one. She took a small sip. The liquor was smooth, burning with a taste of herbs and smoke. She said he promised her that one day he'd own the whole lot, that he'd build a house there, with a tree right in the middle of the courtyard, and no one could ever tell them not to take the figs. Tommaso was utterly still. She could see his reflection in the dark glass, his eyes closed. For a long minute, the only sound was Matteo's breathing. He had taken the memory, this intimate, secret thing, and he had held it in his hands. It was real. When he turned, the vulnerability was gone, sealed away behind a mask of cold intensity. "Why are you really here, Alara Volterra? Do not insult my intelligence with more stories about your thesis." This was the moment, the point of no return. She met his gaze, letting a flicker of the steel she kept hidden show in her own eyes. "I told you. My grandmother never forgot his promise. She believed he was a man of his word. She died believing that. I'm here to find out if she was a fool." A dangerous, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. It didn't reach his eyes. "And if you discover you have risked your life for a fool's belief? Then I will have learned a very valuable lesson about the world," she whispered. "And about the men in it." He studied her, his gaze like a physical touch, tracing the lines of her face, the set of her jaw. He was recalculating. She wasn't just a sentimental girl. She was a judge. She had come to pass sentence on the man he had become. The sudden, sharp buzz of his phone shattered the tension. He pulled it from his pocket, his eyes scanning the screen. The shift in his posture was immediate and terrifying. The man reflecting on the past was gone. The architect was back. His jaw tightened, his body coiling with lethal energy. He typed a one-word reply and put the phone away. His eyes locked with hers. "It seems your lesson is about to begin sooner than you thought." He walked to the door, pausing with his hand on the knob. "Do not make a sound. Do not leave this room. No matter what you hear." He left, pulling the door shut. But this time, Alara heard a different, more final sound. The distinct, heavy thud of a deadbolt sliding into place from the outside. He hadn't just locked her in. He had locked the world out, a fortress preparing for a siege. She rushed to the door, pressing her ear against the cool wood. For a moment there was nothing. Then a distant, muffled crack, like a car backfiring, but she knew it wasn't. It was the sound that had punctuated her grandmother's darkest stories. It was the sound that had haunted her own childhood nightmares. It was a gunshot, and it was inside the house. The gunshot was a stone dropped into the silent pond of the penthouse. The resulting chaos was a ripple of shouted commands, the pounding of heavy boots on marble, and another, closer pop-pop that was unmistakably return fire. Alara's body moved before her mind could fully process the terror. Instinct, honed by a life lived in the shadow of this very world, took over. She dropped to the floor, crawling to Matteo's bed. The little boy was stirring, his face crumpling in confusion. She gently placed a hand over his mouth, her own heart hammering against the parquet floor. "Shh, Piccolo, shh," she whispered, her voice a frantic prayer. "We have to be very quiet, like a game." His wide, fearful eyes stared back at her. She scanned the room. The door was a death trap. The window was triple-paned, and she was certain bulletproof. But it was a fishbowl. They were trapped. The sound of a struggle erupted right outside the door, a guttural shout, a sickening thud of a body hitting the wall, then silence. A key scraped in the lock. Alara scrambled back, pulling a terrified Matteo with her, putting the bulk of the bed between them and the door. She grabbed a heavy, crystal bookend from the nightstand, her grip slippery with sweat. It was a pathetic weapon, but it was all she had. The door swung open. Tommaso stood there, his silhouette filling the frame. But he was different. The controlled, elegant predator was gone. The This man was feral. His sweater was torn at the collar, a fresh bloody gash marred his temple, and in his hand he held a sleek black pistol as if it were a natural extension of his arm. His eyes, wild and dark, swept the room, finding her instantly. "Get away from the window," he commanded, his voice a low, urgent rasp. He didn't wait for her to comply. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, his gaze catching on the bookend in her white-knuckled grip. A flicker of something, not amusement, but a grim acknowledgement, passed through his eyes. He ignored it. The safe room. Now. He moved to a section of the wall that looked no different from the rest, a panel of polished walnut. He pressed a sequence against the grain, and a section hissed open, revealing a dim, steel-lined space beyond. Alara didn't argue. She scooped up a sobbing Matteo, his small body trembling against hers. She hurried toward the opening as she passed Tommaso, the scent of his cologne, cedar and something dark, like gunpowder, mingled with the coppery tang of blood, filling her senses. It was the smell of violence. It was the smell of her childhood. She stumbled into the small, cool space. It was a bunker, stark and functional, with a bench, bottled water, and a bank of monitors showing camera feeds from all over the penthouse. On one screen, she saw 2 of Tommaso's men, their bodies contorted in the unnatural angles of death, lying in the grand hallway. On the other hand, shadowy figures in black tactical gear moved with chilling efficiency, clearing rooms. Tommaso followed her in, sealing the door with a heavy, hydraulic hiss. The sounds of the outside world vanished, replaced by the hum of machinery and Matteo's muffled cries. They were buried alive. He didn't look at the screens. He looked at her, his chest rising and falling with controlled breaths. He holstered his weapon at the small of his back, his movements economical and precise. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, unable to form words. She was clutching Matteo so tightly she was probably hurting him. His gaze shifted to the boy, and for a fraction of a second, the ferocity in his eyes softened into something else. Something like anguish. "He doesn't like the dark," Tommaso said, his voice rough. It was the first truly personal and vulnerable thing he had revealed. Before Alara could process it, a calm and clear voice came from a hidden speaker. "Silas." "Status?" Tommaso pressed a button on the wall. "Secure. 2 hostiles neutralized at my location. The asset and the variable are with me." His eyes flicked to Alara as he said it. "She was the variable, a piece on a chessboard." "Confirmed," Silas replied. The primary breach was a 4-person team from the service elevator. They knew the blind spots. This was an inside job. The Lombardos are claiming credit, but the sophistication... "It's wrong." "Find the leak, Silas," Tommaso growled, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "I want the architect of this. Alive." "Understood. Perimeter is locked. The remaining hostiles are contained in the West Wing. They are searching for something, or someone." Tommaso's head snapped up, his eyes locking with Alara's across the small, sterile room. The unspoken question hung in the air, charged and terrifying. The men with guns weren't just here to kill Tommaso. They were hunting. And in a locked safe room, trapped with the most wanted man on the lake, Alara knew with a chilling certainty exactly who they were looking for. Her. The word hung in the sterile air, unspoken but deafening. Her. The attackers weren't just here for a power grab. They were here for the variable, the unknown element. And Tommaso's icy composure shattered into something far more dangerous. He stared at Alara as if seeing her for the first time, not as a ghost from his past, but as the epicenter of a violent present storm. "Who sent you?" The question was a low, venomous whisper. He took a step toward her, and the small space he was moving felt like a pounce. The gash on his temple wept a single dark trail of blood down his cheek. Was this the plan all along? Get inside my head? Get inside my home and open the door for them? No. The denial was ripped from her, raw and honest. She clutched Matteo tighter, using his small, warm body as an anchor to reality. "I don't know who they are. I came alone. You expect me to believe that?" He was now standing before her, his presence overwhelming. The scent of blood and gunpowder was suffocating. They bypassed systems that cost millions. They knew about the safe room's electromagnetic shield that blocks all signals. They knew exactly when to strike. And you, with your song and your story, arrived days before. You are either the luckiest woman alive, or you are a liar. He was right. The coincidence was astronomical. And she was a liar, just not the kind he thought. She had come with a secret agenda, but it wasn't to get him killed in a home invasion. Her mission was far more personal, far more dangerous to the core of who he was than a simple assassination. On the monitor, they watched as two of the black-clad figures methodically ransacked the nursery, overturning the very crib Matteo had been sleeping in minutes before. They weren't looking for documents. They were looking for a person. "They're not Lombardos," Ilara heard herself say, her voice surprisingly steady. Tommaso's furious gaze narrowed. "What?" She nodded toward the screen, her training as an observer of human behavior kicking in, cutting through the fear. "Look at them. Their movements. Synchronized, efficient, no wasted motion. They're not enforcers, they're professionals, soldiers. The Lombardos are thugs. They break things. These men are searching. This is a retrieval mission." Her analysis, cool and clinical, landed in the tense space between them. It was the last thing he expected, a moment of strategic clarity from the weeping, sentimental girl he'd locked in the nursery. The fury in his eyes banked, replaced by a swift, calculating reassessment. The variable was demonstrating unexpected functions. Silas's voice broke through the speaker. Tense. "Tommaso, we have a problem. The team in the nursery, they just aborted. They're falling back to the service elevator. It's a clean, tactical retreat. They didn't find what they came for." "Stop them," Tommaso ordered, his voice a whip crack. "We can't. They've rigged the main stairwell with explosives. They're gone. They were gone." The immediate threat was over, but the silence they left behind was more terrifying than the gunfire. The penthouse was a battlefield. 2 men were dead, and a team of elite mercenaries had just invaded one of the most secure private residences in Europe to find Ilara and failed. The hydraulic seal on the door released with a sigh. The safe room was no longer a refuge. It felt like a confessional. Tommaso didn't move. He stood looking down at her, his breath stirring the hair on her forehead. The air crackled with a new, dangerous energy, the energy of a shared secret, of a shattered reality. He reached out, and Ilara flinched, expecting violence. But his hand, surprisingly gentle, brushed a stray tear from her cheek that she hadn't even realized had fallen. His thumb was rough, calloused. The touch was electric, a jolt that went straight to her core. It was a caretaker's gesture from a killer. "You saved him," Tommaso said quietly, his eyes dropping to Matteo, who had finally cried himself into an exhausted sleep in her arms. "You kept him quiet. You kept him safe." He looked back at her, his flint-gray eyes holding hers, and in their depths, the storm finally broke. The anger was gone, replaced by a profound, unsettling curiosity. And something else, a possessive, darkening heat. "It seems," he murmured, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in her bones. "I now owe you a debt." He didn't say thank you. In his world, debts were a more powerful currency than gratitude. And as he looked at her, the woman with the lullaby, the liar, the unintended shield for his most vulnerable ward, Ilara knew the balance of power between them had irrevocably shifted. She was no longer just a variable to be assessed. She was a prize to be kept. The penthouse was a crime scene wrapped in a fortress. The 2 fallen guards were gone, their bodies discreetly removed, but the scent of cordite and the coppery hint of blood still haunted the air. Dark smudges on the polished marble floor were the only eulogy. Silas moved through the chaos with a quiet, grim efficiency, directing a cleanup crew that worked with the silent speed of morticians. Tommaso didn't let Ilara out of his sight. He guided her, his hand a firm, inescapable pressure on the small of her back, from the safe room to his private study. Matteo had been whisked away by a severe-looking woman introduced only as the doctor. The little boy's whimper as he was taken from Ilara's arms felt like a physical wound. The study was a sanctuary of order, a stark contrast to the violence that surrounded it. Tommaso led her to a leather armchair by the cold fireplace. "Sit." It was not a request. He went to a sideboard and poured a generous measure of brandy into a crystal snifter. He didn't pour one for himself. He brought it to her, his fingers brushing against hers as he handed her the glass. The brief contact was like a spark on dry tinder. Drink. You're in shock. She was. Her hands were trembling so violently that the amber liquid sloshed against the sides of the glass. She took a sip, the heat spreading through her chest, a small anchor of sensation in a world that had gone mad. He watched her, his gaze analytical, missing nothing. Silas entered, his tablet in hand. His eyes, usually so impassive, held a grim light. The explosives were professional grade, untraceable. The team exfiltrated via the lake. A boat with no registration picked them up. They vanished into the fog. Who were they? Tommaso's voice was dangerously calm. Not Lombardo's, Silas confirmed, his gaze flicking to Alara for a fraction of a second. Their tactics, their gear, it's paramilitary, private contractor level. This was an expensive operation. The question is, who paid the bill, and why were they targeting her? He turned the tablet to show a grainy, enhanced still from a security camera. It showed one of the invaders, his face obscured by a balaclava, but clearly studying a photograph in his hand before entering the nursery. The picture was of Alara, taken from her university ID. A cold dread, deeper than any fear of gunfire, settled in her stomach. This was not part of the plan. This was a complication she had never anticipated. Someone else was playing a game, and she was a piece on their board, too. Tommaso took the tablet, his jaw tightening as he stared at the image. They didn't want to kill her. They wanted to take her. He looked at Alara, the question burning in his eyes. Who wants you this badly, Alara? And why? The lies she had so carefully constructed felt like tissue paper in a hurricane. She had to tell him the truth, a piece of the real puzzle. She set the brandy glass down, the crystal clicking sharply against the wooden table. My grandmother. She didn't just tell me stories about a boy and a fig tree, she began, her voice low. She told me one other thing. She said that before Tommaso left Sicily, he gave her something for safekeeping. She said it was a key. Not a real key, a secret. She said that if anything ever happened to him, this secret would be his legacy. His revenge. Tommaso went perfectly still. What was it? Alara met his gaze, her own filled with a genuine, desperate fear. She never told me. She said the knowledge was a death sentence. She took it to her grave. She let the tears well in her eyes, and this time, they were real. But someone must believe she told me. They must think I have it. The silence in the room was absolute. The only sound was the hum of the servers in the wall. Tommaso and Silas exchanged a long, unreadable look. A secret, a legacy, a key. It was the kind of myth that could start a war, or end one. Tommaso walked to the window, his back to them. He stared out at the dark, placid lake that had just swallowed his attackers. He had built an empire on blood and secrets, and now a new, more dangerous secret had walked into his life, singing a lullaby. He turned back, his decision made. His eyes were no longer curious. They were possessive. Absolute. Then it seems you are now under my protection, he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. Not as a guest, not as a nanny, but as a vital asset. These men will not stop. They will assume you have talked, that I now possess this key. We are targets together now. He moved toward her, stopping so close she had to tilt her head back to look up at him. He reached out, and this time, his fingers gently traced the line of her jaw, a gesture of terrifying intimacy. You wanted to know if the boy from the stories was a man of his word, he murmured, his voice a dark promise. You will have your answer. I promised to protect Sophia. I failed. I will not fail her granddaughter. The threat was clear. The promise was a cage. He wasn't letting her go. Not until he had the secret she claimed not to know. Not until he had used her to draw out the enemies who had dared to breach his home. She was safe from the men outside. But she was now a prisoner of the most dangerous man she had ever met. And as his thumb stroked her skin, a treacherous, shocking part of her felt a thrill at the touch. The game had just become infinitely more complex, and the most terrifying thing of all was that she no longer knew which side she was on. The transfer was not a suggestion. It was a military operation. Within the hour, Alara found herself ushered into the back of a black, armored SUV with windows so dark they felt like a void. Tommaso slid in beside her, his large frame taking up the space, making the luxurious interior feel claustrophobic. Silas was in the passenger seat, a laptop open on his knees, his fingers flying across the keyboard. Two more identical SUVs filled with silent, hard-eyed men flanked them from the front and back. No one spoke. The only sound was the soft purr of the engine and the rhythmic thump of the windshield wipers against a sudden, weeping rain. Alara watched the lights of Como disappear behind them, swallowed by the winding road that climbed into the Prealps. She was leaving the only known variable in this equation. She was being taken to the heart of Tommaso's world, a place from which there would be no easy escape. She risked a glance at him. He was staring straight ahead, his profile sharp and unreadable in the intermittent glow of passing streetlights. The cut on his temple had been cleaned and stitched, a stark black line against his skin. He was a man who bore his scars without apology. He felt her gaze and turned his head slowly. His eyes, reflecting the dim dashboard lights, seemed to see right through her. "Are you afraid of me, Alara?" The question was so quiet, so unexpected, it felt like a trap. She considered lying, but something in his demeanor demanded the truth. "Yes," she whispered, a faint, almost imperceptible nod. "Good. Fear will keep you alive, but you do not need to fear me." He turned his body slightly toward her, his voice dropping even lower, for her ears only. "The men who came for you tonight. They are not bound by any code. They are ghosts. They will not negotiate. They will not make threats. They will simply take or kill. I am the only thing standing between you and that. Remember that. It wasn't a comfort. It was a stark, brutal realignment of her reality. He was her jailer and her protector, a duality that made her head spin. The car navigated a series of sharp turns, then slowed. High wrought iron gates, adorned with a simple, severe G for Grimaldi, swung open silently. They drove down a long, cypress-lined drive, emerging into a vast courtyard. The house wasn't a modern penthouse. It was an old and formidable villa, built from pale stone that glowed in the security lights. It looked less like a home and more like a fortress that had been standing for centuries, weathering countless storms. This was the actual seat of his power. They were ushered inside into a grand foyer, all cool marble and ancient tapestries. The air smelled of lemon polish and old stone. A tall, elegant woman with silver hair pulled into a severe chignon stood waiting, her hands clasped. Her eyes, the same flint gray as Tommaso's, swept over Alara with impersonal assessment. "Alessandra," Tommaso said by way of introduction. "My aunt, she manages the household." He turned to the woman. "She is our guest. See that she has everything she needs. The blue room, next to mine." Alessandra's eyebrow arched almost imperceptibly, but she merely nodded. "Of course, Tommaso." Her voice was like dry ice. "Guest." The word was a fiction, and everyone in the echoing hall knew it. The blue room next to mine was not a courtesy. It was a statement of control. She was being placed within arm's reach, for his protection or for his pleasure. The line was already blurring. She was led up a sweeping staircase and down a long, shadowy corridor. Alessandra opened a heavy wooden door, revealing a room that was both beautiful and suffocating. It was decorated in shades of cobalt and cream, with a massive canopied bed and a balcony overlooking the dark, rolling hills. It was a princess's room in a dragon's lair. "The door locks from the outside," Alessandra said calmly, as if commenting on the weather. "For your safety, of course. Dinner will be served at 8. Do not attempt to leave. The grounds are not safe for strangers." With that she left, pulling the door shut. Alara heard the definitive heavy click of the lock. She was alone. Again. But this was different. This was older, deeper. The walls here seemed to have absorbed centuries of secrets. She walked to the balcony, testing the French doors. They were locked, electronically, with a keypad she couldn't see. She was in a gilded cage, more opulent and far more remote than the last. She wrapped her arms around herself, the silence pressing in. Downstairs, Tommaso was planning hunting. He was in his element, and she was his bait, his prisoner, and the keeper of a secret that didn't exist. A soft tap on the connecting door to the adjacent room made her jump. Before she could answer, it opened. Tommaso stood there, changed into a simple black t-shirt and trousers. He held a small first aid kit. "You're favoring your right arm," he said, his gaze dropping to the hand she had unconsciously been cradling. She had wrenched it when she dove to the floor with Matteo. "Let me see. It wasn't a request. It was an order, but it was delivered with a strange, practical gentleness." He crossed the room, took her hand in his, and began to examine her wrist. His touch was sure, his fingers warm. He was so close that she could see the individual lashes framing his intense eyes and smell the clean scent of soap on his skin. "This is just a sprain," he murmured, his thumb pressing gently along the bones. He looked up and his eyes captured hers. "The men who are after you, they will not be this gentle, Ilara. Remember that too." In that moment, trapped in his gaze, feeling the heat of his skin on hers, Ilara understood the actual danger. The physical threat was real and terrifying. But the greater threat was him. The way his protectiveness felt like a caress. The way his dominance made him feel a sense of safety. He was breaking down her defenses not with violence, but with a terrifying, focused attention that made her feel like she was the only woman in the world. And the most horrifying part was that a treacherous, desperate part of her never wanted it to end. Dinner was a solitary, surreal affair. A silent, efficient maid brought a tray of exquisite food. Handmade pasta, a salad with edible flowers, a delicate piece of fish, and set it on a small table in her room. She ate alone, the clink of her silverware echoing in the vast, opulent space. The food was perfect, and it tasted like ash. Every moment of silence, every locked door, was a reminder of her powerlessness. After the maid collected the tray, the lock clicked once more. Ilara paced, the plush carpet swallowing her footsteps. She was a bird in a gilded cage, her wings clipped. She had to regain some control, some leverage. The story of the key had bought her time, but it was a fragile shield. Once Tommaso decided it was a dead end, or that she was more trouble than she was worth, her protection would vanish. A soft electronic hum came from the door to Tommaso's room. It wasn't a knock. It was the sound of the lock disengaging. The door swung inward. Tommaso stood there holding 2 glasses of red wine. He had changed again, into dark, tailored trousers and a simple white linen shirt. The sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing the corded muscles of his forearms and the stark black lines of a tattoo she couldn't quite decipher. He looked less like a Mafia lord and more like a Renaissance prince in his private chambers. The intimacy of it was staggering. "Your prison does not include a dry dinner," he said, his voice a low rumble. He entered without waiting for an invitation, placing 1 glass on the table beside her. He moved to the balcony doors, tapping a code into the hidden keypad. They unlocked with a soft click. "The air is fresh tonight. Come." It was a command, but it felt like an invitation to a precipice. She followed him out onto the fabulous stone balcony. The view was breathtaking. The storm had cleared, revealing a sky dusted with 1,000,000 stars, their light reflecting on the dark, mirror-like surface of a lake far below. The air was cold and clean, scented with pine and damp earth. It was a world away from the violence that had occurred just hours ago. He stood beside her, close but not touching, and sipped his wine. "This land has been in my mother's family for 300 years, he said, his gaze sweeping the dark horizon. "It does not change. The world outside, it is noise. But here, things are simple, clear. Are they?" Ilara asked softly, daring to challenge him. She turned to face him, leaning her back against the cold stone balustrade. "It seems the noise found its way in tonight." He looked at her, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "The noise is always there. The skill is in controlling what you let inside the walls." He took a step closer, his presence blocking out the starlight. "You are inside the walls now, Ilara. The question is, what kind of noise are you?" Before she could answer, Silas appeared in the doorway, his face illuminated by his tablet. He didn't apologize for the interruption. "We have something." Tommaso didn't move away from her. "Speak." "The financial forensics on the shell companies we pulled from the Lombardo servers," Silas began, his eyes flicking to Ilara for a moment before returning to Tommaso. "There's a pattern. A series of payments, extensive, routed through a bank in Malta. They started 6 months ago. The beneficiary is a holding company called Orpheus Investments." Tommaso's expression darkened. "I don't know it." "You wouldn't," Silas said. "It's a ghost. But the payments are consistent. The last one was made 48 hours ago. He paused, letting the significance hang in the air. The timing coincides with Ilara's arrival in Como. Tommaso finally turned from her, his full attention on Silas. The Lombardos were paid to be a distraction. A loud, messy front while the real players moved in. Precisely, Silas confirmed. The attack on the penthouse was a precision strike. The Lombardos were the fireworks. Someone hired them to make noise, to tie up our resources, while the professional team went in for the real objective. He looked directly at Ilara. They weren't just hired to take you, Miss Volterra. They were hired to take you quietly during the chaos. The Lombardos were the hammer. They were the scalpel. The revelation landed like a physical blow. This was bigger, far more calculated than she had ever imagined. It wasn't a rival family. It was a shadowy, wealthy entity that operated like a corporation, using one mafia clan as a pawn to attack another, all in an effort to reach her. Tommaso turned back to her, his eyes gleaming in the starlight. The possessive dark heat was back, but now it was mixed with a fierce, terrifying excitement. The hunter had caught the scent of truly worthy prey. Orpheus, he murmured, the name a whisper on the night air. The musician who went into the underworld to retrieve his love. He reached out, and his fingers, warm and sure, brushed a strand of hair from her cheek, tucking it behind her ear. His touch sent a shiver straight down her spine. It seems you have a very powerful admirer, Ilara. One who will tear the world apart to bring you to his underworld. He leaned in, his lips close to her ear, his breath a warm caress. But they made a mistake. What mistake? She breathed, her heart hammering against her ribs. His voice was a dark, possessive vow. They tried to take what is mine. The word hung in the air between them, shattering every remaining pretense. Mine. It wasn't about the secret anymore. It wasn't about a debt. It was a primal, brutal claim, and as his gaze dropped to her lips, Ilara knew the most dangerous game had just begun, and she was no longer just a player. She was the prize. The word, mine, echoed in the silence after Silas withdrew, leaving them alone on the balcony under the cold, watchful stars. It was a claim, a brand, and a sentence all in one. Ilara's breath hitched, her body tensing as if preparing for a fight or an impossible flight. The night air, once fresh, now felt charged and too thin to breathe. Tommaso didn't move away. He studied her reaction, his eyes reading the conflict in her face, the fear, the shock, and beneath it, a flicker of something else he was determined to exploit. He took the wine glass from her unresisting hand and set it next to his on the balustrade. The gesture was unnervingly domestic. "You are trembling," he observed, his voice low. He didn't sound pleased, nor was he mocking. It was a simple, factual statement that felt more intimate than a touch. "It's cold," she lied, her voice a shaky whisper. A slow, knowing smile touched his lips. It transformed his face, carving out a hint of the reckless boy he must have once been. Liar. He shrugged out of his linen shirt, leaving him in only the thin black t-shirt beneath. He didn't hand it to her. Instead, he stepped behind her and draped it over her shoulders, his arms coming around her to pull the fabric closed at her front. His body was a solid wall of heat at her back. The scent of him, clean cotton, cedar, and that indefinable dark spice of his skin, engulfed her. It was an embrace, but it wasn't gentle. It was possessive. His chin nearly rested on the top of her head, his breath stirring her hair. She was trapped, cocooned in his warmth, his strength, his unyielding will. "Better?" he murmured against her hair. She couldn't speak. She could only nod, her muscles locked in a battle between the instinct to shove him away and the terrifying, shameful desire to melt back into him. This was the actual seduction of the dark romance he offered. Not flowers or sweet words, but the primal, absolute promise of safety within his orbit. A safety that came at the cost of her very self. "They will not have you, Ilara," he vowed, his voice a low vibration against her spine. "Orpheus can send an army of ghosts. They will break against my walls. I am the only underworld you need to fear, and the only one who can protect you from it." He turned her in his arms, his hands firm on her shoulders. The shirt, still warm from his body, hung loosely on her frame. His gaze was intense, searching. But protection requires truth. You have given me pieces. I need the rest. Why you? Why now? What is this key that a phantom would spend a fortune to acquire? This was the moment. The lies had brought her this far, into the dragon's den and into his arms. But to go further, to survive, she had to weave a truth into the fiction, to make the story real enough to believe. Tears, real and hot, welled in her eyes. They were not entirely for show. The pressure, the fear, the sheer insanity of her situation crashed down on her. I don't know what the key is, she cried, her voice breaking with a sincerity that shocked even her. But my grandmother, before she died, she was frightened. She said they were watching her. She told me that if anything happened, I was to find you, that you were the only one who could understand, that the key was about your father's legacy, not just hers. It was a gamble, a shift in the story. She was no longer just a curious granddaughter. She was a messenger, a final plea from a dead woman. Tommaso's hands tightened on her shoulders. My father? The words were sharp, laced with a history of bitterness. What does my father have to do with this? I don't know, she repeated, letting the tears fall. She said it was the reason he was killed, not a random act of violence, that he had discovered something, taken it, and given it to her for safekeeping. She said it was a key to everything. And now whoever killed him knows, she told me. They think I have it. She was so close to him she could see the dilation of his pupils, the flicker of ancient pain and fresh, burning rage in his eyes. She had hooked him, not with sentiment, but with a mystery that struck at the very foundation of his life, the unsolved murder of his father. He was silent for a long moment, his gaze boring into hers, weighing her every word, every tear. The night seemed to hold its breath. Then one of his hands lifted from her shoulder. He cupped her cheek, his thumb stroking away a tear with a shocking tenderness that felt more violent than a slap. Then we will find it together, he whispered, his voice raw. We will find this key and we will use it to destroy them all. He leaned in. Alara's eyes fluttered shut, her heart a wild, trapped bird in her chest. She expected a kiss, a claiming, a seal on their dark pact. But his lips didn't find hers. They brushed against her forehead. A whisper of a touch that was somehow more intimate, more devastating than any kiss could have been. It was a benediction, a vow. When he pulled back, his eyes were burning with a new, terrifying light. Sleep, Alara, you are safe tonight. He turned and walked back into his room, closing the connecting door behind him. She heard the soft, final click of the lock, but this time it felt different. She stood there, shaking, wrapped in his shirt, the scent of him clinging to her skin, his vow echoing in her mind. She was safe from the ghosts outside, but as she touched the spot on her forehead where his lips had been, she knew with a terrifying certainty that she had never been in more danger. She had just made a deal with the devil to survive the abyss, and the price was her soul. Sleep was impossible. The phantom pressure of Tommaso's lips on her forehead was a brand. The scent of him on the shirt she still wore was an intoxicating poison. Alara paced the blue room, her mind a whirlwind of fear, guilt, and a treacherous, thrilling anticipation. She had thrown a stone into the deep, dark well of his past, and she was terrified of what might climb out. Just before dawn, a soft, insistent knock came at the connecting door. It wasn't Tommaso. It was Silas. He stood in the hallway, his face, illuminated by the cool gray pre-dawn light, his expression grimly satisfied. We need you both in the study, he said, his tone leaving no room for refusal. We've cracked the first shell. Tommaso was already there, standing before a large monitor, a steaming espresso in his hand. He was back in his uniform of a dark suit, the brief vulnerability of the night before locked away behind a mask of ruthless focus. His eyes, however, flicked to her the moment she entered, a quick, assessing glance that took in the fact she was still wearing his shirt. A possessive gleam flashed in their depths, so fast she might have imagined it. On the screen was a complex web of financial transactions, names, and dates. Silas zoomed in on one node. Orpheus Investments. We followed the money trail through Malta, and it led us here. He tapped the screen. a private, members-only auction house in Milan. Astarians. They specialize in disputed antiquities. Tommaso's gaze sharpened. What was purchased? Not a what. A who. Silas brought up a new document, a scanned, faded ledger page. 6 months ago, the same day the first payment was made to the Lombardos, a client of Astarian's placed the winning bid on a specific service, the retrieval of a person of interest. The client's code name was Orpheus, the target's description. He turned to look at Alara. Matches you perfectly. The air left Alara's lungs. It was one thing to suspect, another to see the cold, transactional proof of her own kidnapping, planned like the acquisition of a piece of art. She was a line item in a ledger. But that's not all, Silas continued, a note of triumph in his voice. Astarians is notoriously paranoid. They keep offline physical backups for their most sensitive clients, paper trails. We have a man on the inside. He can get us the original client file for Orpheus. It will have everything. Bank accounts, communication channels, perhaps even an identity. Where? Tommaso's voice was a blade. The file is kept in a secure vault at their Milan gallery. Our man can get us in tonight during a gala event. A high society crowd with plenty of noise and distraction. But he can only turn off the vault alarms for 10 minutes. It's an in and out operation. Any longer, and we're compromised. Tommaso didn't hesitate. We go tonight. Tommaso, Silas interjected, a rare note of caution in his voice. It's a high-risk extraction. Sending a team in, it's not enough. Tommaso finished, his eyes locking on Alara. She comes with us. A jolt of pure fear shot through her. What? Why? Because you are the expert, he said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. You are a musicologist. Astarians is hosting a gala celebrating the music of the spheres and Renaissance art. Your cover is perfect. You are my guest, and while we are there, you will be the one to identify the file. This is insane, she breathed. I'm not a thief. No, he agreed, stepping closer. He reached out and straightened the collar of his shirt on her shoulders, his fingers brushing her neck. A shiver racked her body. You are the bait and the key. Orpheus wants you, so we will dangle you in the heart of his own operation. We will use his greed against him. His voice dropped to a whisper. You wanted to see the man I am, Alara? Tonight, you will not be watching from a locked room. You will be standing right beside me. The audacity of the plan was breathtaking. It was a direct, arrogant challenge to his unseen enemy. He wasn't hiding. He was parading his prize in public, daring them to try and take her. It was the most dangerous game of all. And if they try to take me there, in the middle of a crowd? Tommaso's smile was a cold, deadly thing. Let them. His hand cupped her cheek, his thumb stroking her skin. I am counting on it. I want to look into the eyes of the man who thinks he can take what is mine. The threat and the promise were intertwined. He was using her as a pawn in his game, and the price of her safety was her active participation in a war she didn't understand. But as she looked into his eyes, seeing the thrilling, terrifying certainty there, she felt a shift within herself. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach. But beneath it, a new emotion was stirring, a dark, addictive excitement. She was no longer just a victim. She was being handed a weapon. She was being invited into the hunt. All right, she heard herself say, her voice surprisingly steady. I'll go. Tommaso's smile widened, a flash of genuine, predatory approval. Good. He leaned in, his lips close to her ear. Wear something beautiful. We are going to a party. He turned and began barking orders to Silas, the plan snapping into place with military precision. Alara stood rooted to the spot, her heart pounding a frantic, warlike rhythm. She had just agreed to walk into the lion's den, but for the first time, she wouldn't be in a cage. she would be walking in on the lion's arm. And the thought was more terrifying and more exhilarating than anything she had ever known. The game was moving to Milan, and she was no longer a piece. She was a player. The dress arrived in a black garment bag, carried by the silent Alessandra. She hung it in the armoire without a word and left. When Alara unzipped it, her breath caught. It was a masterpiece of midnight blue velvet, so dark, it was almost black, cut with a severe, elegant line that promised to hug her every curve. It was not a dress meant to blend in. It was a statement. It was armor. A stylist arrived an hour later, a flurry of quiet efficiency, transforming her from a frightened academic into the consort of a king. Her hair was swept into an intricate, seemingly effortless knot at the nape of her neck, a few artful strands escaping to frame her face. Makeup was minimal, but strategic. A darkening of the lash line that made her green eyes seem more profound, more mysterious. When she slipped into the dress, the cool velvet whispered against her skin, the weight of it both a burden and a strange source of strength. She looked in the full-length mirror and barely recognized herself. She looked powerful, dangerous, like she belonged in Tommaso's world. A soft knock preceded Tommaso's entrance. He stood in the doorway, having changed into a tuxedo of such impeccable, severe cut, it could only be bespoke. The black wool seemed to absorb the light, making his broad shoulders look even wider, his presence even more commanding. His eyes traveled over her, a slow, deliberate appraisal that felt more intimate than a touch. The approval in his gaze was a palpable heat. "They will not be able to look away," he said, his voice low. He walked toward her, holding a small velvet box. He opened it. Inside, nestled on black silk, was a necklace. A single teardrop sapphire the size of her thumbnail, surrounded by tiny, brilliant diamonds. It was breathtakingly beautiful and utterly cold. "A necessary prop," he murmured, moving behind her. His fingers brushed the sensitive skin of her neck as he fastened the clasp. The cold stone settled against her collarbone, a heavy, glittering lie. "It contains a transmitter. Silas will always know where you are. And this," he produced a hairpin from his pocket, a sleek silver twist. "The end unscrews. It's a single dose, enough to incapacitate a man for 10 minutes. Stick it in the neck or the thigh." He placed the cool metal in her palm. It felt impossibly heavy. He was arming her, not just with tools, but with his trust, however conditional. He was turning her into his accomplice. "Remember the plan," he said, his hands resting on her bare shoulders, his eyes meeting hers in the mirror. "We arrive. We mingle. You are Alara Volterra, musicologist, my new fascination. At 9:45 you will complain of a headache. I will take you to the private lounge on the second floor to rest. Silas will meet us there. From there, we have 10 minutes. His grip tightened slightly. "If anything goes wrong, if you feel a hand on you that is not mine, you use the pin. You run. You do not look back. Do you understand?" She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. The reality of the danger was crashing down, the glamour peeling back to reveal the brutal machinery beneath. The drive to Milan was a silent, tense affair in another armored car. This time, Tommaso held her hand, his thumb absently stroking her knuckles. It wasn't a lover's gesture. It was a handler steadying his asset. But her traitorous body responded to it anyway, a thread of warmth weaving through the cold fear. Asterion's was housed in a palazzo overlooking the Duomo, its Renaissance facade glowing golden against the night sky. The moment they stepped out of the car, they were swallowed by a whirlwind of flashing cameras and shouted questions. Tommaso ignored them all, his arm a firm, possessive band around her waist, guiding her through the chaos and up the grand staircase into the heart of the gala. It was like stepping into a different century. The ballroom was a symphony of gilt and frescoes, filled with the glittering elite of Europe. Women in jewels that could ransom kings, men with the casual, bored authority of old money and older power. And yet, as Tommaso Grimaldi entered with an unknown woman on his arm, a hush seemed to ripple through the crowd. All eyes turned to them. To her, he had been right. They couldn't look away. He led her through the room, a shark moving through a school of lesser fish. He introduced her. This is Alara. No title. No explanation. It was a power move, leaving them to speculate, to wonder. She played her part, offering a serene smile and engaging in small talk about the music-themed art, her knowledge flowing easily as she built the perfect cover. But beneath the surface, her heart was a frantic drum. She scanned the crowd, every face a potential threat, every glance a possible hunter. She felt exposed, a lamb paraded before wolves. But the hand at her back was steady, a constant, unyielding reminder of the wolf who walked beside her. She felt a specific pair of eyes on her, colder and more focused than the rest. She turned her head slightly and met the gaze of a tall, silver-haired man across the room. He stood with a group of investors, but his attention was entirely fixed on her. He didn't smile. He watched, his expression one of cold, clinical interest, like a scientist observing a rare specimen. He raised his champagne flute in a subtle, almost imperceptible toast directly to her, a chill, deeper than any she had felt all night, slithered down her spine. Tommaso felt her tense. He followed her gaze, his own eyes narrowing. He pulled her closer, his lips brushing her ear. "I see him," he murmured, his voice a dark promise. Let him look. Let him see what he can never have. The game was on. The players were on the board, and in 10 minutes, they would make their move. The private lounge was an oasis of quiet, a small, book-lined room off the main gallery. The moment the door closed, the muffled sounds of the gala vanished, replaced by a ringing silence. Silas was already there, waiting by a section of bookshelves. Without a word, he pressed a hidden mechanism, and a portion of the shelving swung inward, revealing a narrow, dimly lit service corridor. 10 minutes. Silas whispered, his voice tight. "The vault is 2 levels down. Our man has looped the cameras, but the pressure sensors on the vault door are still active. Once it's open, the clock starts." Tommaso gave a sharp nod. He looked at Alara, his eyes blazing with intensity. "Stay close." They moved quickly, single file down the stark concrete stairs. The air grew cooler, smelling of dust and old stone. This was the palazzo's skeleton, hidden beneath the gilded skin. At the bottom, a heavy modern steel door stood out against the ancient brickwork. A keypad glowed beside it. Silas worked swiftly, attaching a small device to the keypad. Numbers flickered across its screen. "The code changes every 60 seconds. This will crack it." A soft beep. The lock disengaged with a heavy thunk. The vault was not large, lined with security deposit boxes of brushed steel. But at the far end was a freestanding antique cabinet of dark wood, the offline archive. Silas went to it, pulling a set of lockpicks from his pocket. "This is it. The physical files." Alara's heart hammered against her ribs. Every second felt like a lifetime. She could hear the blood pounding in her ears. Tommaso stood by the door, a silent sentinel, his body coiled, his hand resting inside his jacket, undoubtedly on the grip of a gun. "Got it," Silas hissed, pulling the cabinet drawer open. It was filled with thick, leather-bound folios. He ran his finger down the labels, pulling one out. Orpheus. He opened it, his eyes scanning the contents. Bank accounts in Zurich, encrypted satellite phone protocols, and a name. The account manager assigned to the client, a man named Klaus Richter. He began taking pictures with a small, high-resolution camera, page after page. Alara moved closer, her eyes darting over the documents. And then she saw it. Tucked into a sleeve on the inside cover of the folio wasn't a document. It was a program for a concert. A performance of the obscure Baroque opera L'Orfeo was held in Vienna 6 months ago. Someone had handwritten a single word on it in elegant looping script. Cavatina. A cavatina. A short, simple aria, her musicologist's mind, even under the crushing pressure, made the connection. Orpheus. The opera, L'Orfeo. It was a clue, a signature. "Tommaso," she whispered, pulling the program free. "Look," he glanced at it, his brow furrowed. Before he could speak, Silas's phone vibrated with a silent alarm. His face went pale. "We've been made," he said. His voice clipped. The silent alarm wasn't on the door. It was in the file. The moment I lifted it, a signal was sent. "They're coming." "How long?" Tommaso's voice was calm, deadly. 2 minutes. Maybe less. Finish. Get every page. Tommaso's gaze snapped to Ilara. "The pin. Are you ready?" She nodded, her fingers closing around the cool metal in her hair, her heart trying to beat its way out of her chest. This was it. The violence was no longer a threat. It was a countdown. Silas snapped the final picture and slammed the folio shut, returning it to the cabinet exactly as he found it. "Done! Let's go." They moved back into the corridor, Silas re-engaging the locks behind them. They took the stairs 2 at a time, bursting back into the quiet lounge. The sounds of the gala felt like a taunt. Tommaso grabbed Ilara's hand, his grip like iron. We walk, slowly, calmly, to the main entrance. They stepped out of the lounge and back into the whirl of the party. Every smile felt like a threat, every glance an accusation. Ilara forced her face into a mask of bored serenity, clinging to Tommaso's arm. She scanned the crowd for the silver-haired man, but he was gone. They were halfway to the grand staircase when 4 men in the discreet black suits of Asterian's security team moved to block their path. They were polite, but their eyes were hard. "Signor Grimaldi," the lead guard said, "a small matter requires your attention. If you and the lady would come with us." Tommaso didn't break stride. "You are in my way." His voice was low, but it carried a whip-crack of authority that made several nearby guests turn their heads. "I must insist," the guard said, his hand moving to rest subtly on the radio at his belt. In that frozen moment, Ilara saw it all unfold. A scene, an arrest, the end of everything. Without thinking, she acted. She let her knees buckle, slumping against Tommaso with a soft, distressed sigh. "Tommaso," she murmured, her voice a breathy, perfect imitation of a faint. "My head. I think I'm going to be—" It was a distraction. A stupid, theatrical, brilliant distraction. All eyes snapped to her. The guards hesitated, their rigid protocol broken by the spectacle of a fainting socialite. It was all the opening Tommaso needed. His concern for her was a convincing performance. He swept her up into his arms, her body limp against his chest. "My fiancé is unwell," he announced, his voice thick with feigned worry. "Get out of my way. Now." The crowd parted. The guards, uncertain and not wanting to cause a scene with an ill woman, faltered. Tommaso carried her down the grand staircase, Silas clearing a path ahead of them. They moved through the lobby and out into the blessed cool of the night air, their car screeching to the curb exactly on time. He bundled her into the back seat, climbing in after her. As the car pulled away, speeding into the Milanese night, he didn't set her down. He kept her cradled in his arms. She opened her eyes, meeting his gaze. The pretense was over. The fear and the adrenaline were real. "Fiancé?" she whispered, her voice shaky. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face, the first one that truly reached his eyes. It transformed him, making him look younger, dangerous, and devastatingly attractive. "It sounded convincing," he said, his thumb stroking her cheek, and then his smile faded, replaced by a look of fierce, possessive triumph. "And you were magnificent." In that moment, covered in the sweat of fear and the glitter of lies, held in the arms of her captor and protector, Ilara knew a terrible, wonderful truth. She wasn't just playing a part anymore. She was living it, and a part of her never wanted it to end. The car was a capsule of charged silence, hurtling them away from the palazzo and back toward the fortress villa. Ilara was still cradled in Tommaso's arms, neither of them moving, the pretense of her faint having melted into a very real, breathless awareness. The sapphire necklace lay cold between them, a stark contrast to the heat radiating from his chest. It was Silas from the front seat who broke the spell. "The data is clean. Klaus Richter is a high-level facilitator for a consortium of old European money. Very discreet, very dangerous. But the concert program—" He turned, holding up his tablet with an image of the leaflet. "This is the key. L'Orfeo. The cavatina." Ilara finally sat up, straightening the velvet of her dress, a conscious effort to reclaim some composure. Her mind, now free from the immediate threat, began to work, the pieces clicking into place with the clarity of a scholar solving an ancient riddle. "It's not just a reference to the myth," she said, her voice gaining strength. "In the opera, Orpheus sings a cavatina to charm the gates of the underworld. It's the key that opens the door." She looked at Tommaso, her eyes wide with the thrill of discovery. "It's a literal key, a musical key, a specific sequence of notes." Tommaso's gaze was locked on her, intense and unwavering. "What does it open?" "I don't know. But my grandmother, she was a pianist. She never owned anything of great value, except for one thing. Her piano, an old, slightly out-of-tune upright. She made me promise never to sell it. She said it held all her memories." Alara's breath hitched as the final, devastating piece of the puzzle fell into place. "It's not a physical key. It's a combination, a sequence of notes you play on that piano. It must trigger a mechanism, a hidden compartment." The car fell silent again, the implications settling like ash. The secret that had gotten his father killed, the treasure a shadowy consortium was willing to wage war over, wasn't a document or a code book. It was a song, a lullaby for a ghost. Tommaso leaned back, a strange, weary respect in his eyes. All this time, they were looking for a safe, and the safe was a song. He looked out the window at the passing darkness. "We go to Bologna. Tomorrow. We find this piano." When they arrived at the villa, the dynamic had irrevocably shifted. He didn't escort her to her room. He led her to his study, where he poured 2 glasses of grappa. He handed one to her, his fingers lingering on hers. "You risked your life tonight," he stated, his voice a low rumble. "Not for yourself, for me, for our objective." "I did what was necessary," she replied, holding his gaze. "That is what makes you dangerous," he said, a dark appreciation in his tone. "And invaluable." He took a step closer, the space between them crackling. "The man you saw tonight, the one who toasted you. His name is Victor Haas. He is the public face of Orpheus. By now he knows we have the clue. He knows we are close. There is no turning back, Alara. You are in this. With me." He didn't say as my prisoner or as my asset. He said, "with me." It was a recognition of partnership, however twisted and born of violence. It was the most honest thing he had ever said to her. "I know," she whispered. He raised his glass. "To the key." She clinked her glass against his. "To the end of this." They drank, the fiery liquid a benediction and a vow. As she lowered her glass, he was there, his hand cupping the back of her neck, his gaze dropping to her lips. This time there was no hesitation, no feigned tenderness. It was a raw, claiming hunger. "I have wanted to do this," he growled, his voice thick with a desire he no longer bothered to conceal. "Since the moment you looked at me with your grandmother's eyes and lied to my face." His mouth captured hers. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a conquest. It was a battle for dominance, filled with the taste of grappa and the lingering adrenaline of the night. It was everything she had feared and secretly craved, the terrifying surrender to his will, the shocking rightness of his touch. Her hands, of their own volition, fisted in the lapels of his tuxedo jacket, pulling him closer, answering his hunger with her own. She was drowning in him, in the dark promise of this world, in the terrifying freedom of having nothing left to lose. When he finally broke the kiss, they were both breathless. He rested his forehead against hers, his breathing ragged. "The boy who loved figs is gone, Alara," he breathed, his voice raw. "He was devoured by the man I became. But tonight, you made that man feel something other than power. You made him feel alive." He pulled back, his flint-gray eyes searching hers. And in their depths, she saw not a monster, but a man, ruthless, damaged, and terrifyingly real. "Stay," he commanded, the word a plea wrapped in steel. "Not in the room next door. Here. With me." It was the final threshold, the point of no return. To step across it was to embrace the darkness, to choose the devil she knew over the abyss of the unknown. She looked at him, at the man who had stopped a war for a lullaby, who saw her not as a victim but as a weapon, and who looked at her now as if she were the only star in a black sky. She placed her hand in his. Yes. It was not a surrender. It was a choice. The first real choice she had made since she walked into his world. She was no longer the girl with the lullaby. She was the woman who had charmed the king of the underworld. And as he led her from the study, away from the ghosts and the guns and the gold, she knew the most dangerous part of the story was beginning. And she was no longer afraid. She was ready.